It's all in your head. You don't look sick. Your tests are normal. It's probably anxiety. There's nothing wrong with you. Have you heard these words from physicians, family, and friends? If you're someone who has been struggling and swirling through the revolving door of healthcare to find answers about your health, or if you know someone who is going through this experience, then this podcast is for you. Welcome to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast with Laura Nozicka. Hello, and welcome to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. I am your host, Laura Nozicka, and I am here today with my dear friend, Paul Kidwell. Paul is the co-host and producer of the podcast In Sickness, Men and the Culture of Caregiving. He also writes a column on caregiving for Rare Revolution. He has 25 years of corporate and agency communications experience with the life science sector. Paul has provided integrated media relations support for product launches, FDA approvals, national and international media campaigns, patient advocacy programs, support of major industry conferences, medical meetings and trade shows, and development of media strategies for the placement of stories in global top-tier business and trade media. Paul is also an established and seasoned patient advocacy professional for biotech companies. Paul holds a master's degree in public relations from Boston University and is based in Boston and currently in piles of snow, if I understand that right.
Absolutely. We have, we had a few weeks ago, Laura, forgive me. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I hope I live up to that advanced billing, and I could not be more delighted to be here with you and joining this conversation. And yes, Boston is snowy and frigid today in late February. It's been this way since early February, and added to that yesterday and the day before are an additional 2 feet. So we are not the record snowfall that we incurred a few years ago, but close to it.
Well, I guess being in Chicago, I should feel pretty lucky that we didn't get all that, because usually it starts here and goes to you.
Right, and usually your winters are extended. It seems like they go on forever and ever.
So I guess the name of the game is to go with the flow. And what I'm guessing, Paul, is through your experience and what we'll be talking about today as a caregiver, there's been a lot of go with the flow for you.
Yeah, seat of the pants, moment to moment, very few futuristic projections, because they will not be met more than likely, particularly within that caregiving realm. And if any of your listeners know of that experience, they will certainly appreciate the fact that it is, in fact, a moment-by-moment experience.
Mm-hmm. And so first, I'd like to extend my condolences, Paul, on the passing of your lovely wife.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, it happened this past August. It came at the end of over 18 years of caring for her. She was diagnosed in 2007 with Parkinson's disease. And if you know of that disease, it is progressive. There are no cures, medicine-wise. There are drugs that treat the disease symptomatically, and by that I mean they control the symptoms, which are largely tremors in the extremities that can be upper body or lower legs. In her case, it was, in fact, her name was AiBai. In AiBai's case, it was her legs that were affected initially, which is how we came to the doctor, because we had started seeing these low-grade tremors in her legs during the evening, relaxing at home after a very hard and long day, which we just felt it was kind of chalked it up to fatigue. We both put in some very long and challenging days. We were parents. We were a husband and a wife. We paid mortgages. We did all of that. And so again, it was just fatigue, and that was it. However, the conditions and the symptoms did persist. They stayed at a baseline, but nonetheless, they weren't going away. So we felt it was worthwhile checking out. So we did make an appointment with a neurologist. and through some in-office testing determined that she did in fact have Parkinson's. And of course, we knew nothing about it. Would we? I mean, I think the only connection I had with Parkinson's at that time was some of these um, on-camera experiences or situations that Michael Fox took, when he was on a talk show or something like that. And he was, I think, years into his own diagnosis. And it was, honestly, it was pretty frightening to watch this young man battle these tremors, not being able to sit still in a chair and moving around and kind of mild thrashing. So that was my connection to Parkinson's. So of course, you imagine only the worst when you understand that it's a progressive disease. And so I thought, well, that's what's going to happen to AiBai years from now. Of course, we were told that it's a different situation for everybody, not surprisingly, much like any progressive illness. However, it was progressive. It would not be cured. She would have it for a long time. How many years? Uncertain. Some people live over 20 years with it. Some live at a shorter time frame. What we were also told was that the medicines, as I said earlier, would take care of the symptoms. They would mask them and help her live a quote normal life by controlling those symptoms. However, as the disease progressed, and if it progressed long enough, those medicines would become less effective, and so you had to continually tweak the medications and the dosing and to try and maintain a semblance of not falling victim to those symptoms. And the also the one thing that we didn't realize but learned along the way is that about 50% of Parkinson's patients will in fact contract some element of dementia, which is actually a result of some of the medicines that they take to control the physical symptoms. So it's kind of a real, very cruel cut when you think you're controlling something, but also potentially giving way to something, in fact, a bit more serious. And that's
Yeah.
exactly what happened. About year 8 or 9, my wife started experiencing hallucinations, delusions, led to agitated behavior. And as we said, 18 years into her illness, a little over 18 years, she passed away.
Paul, tell us about AiBai. What was she like? What were
Oh
some
my
of the
God.
things
Well,
that you'd like us to know about her?
uh, yeah, she was the love of my life. I mean, that's how I always referred to her. Um, I was, with her, I was punching out of my weight class. I
Oh,
was, I always felt that she was just extraordinary in so many ordinary ways that how could I not fall in love with her? And which I did, head over heels. And the things that I loved about her, uh, the fact that she allowed for my idiosyncrasies. This very tall American with a penchant for cooking and opera and country music. She accommodated all of that into her life. The things that I loved about her was she's a great ballroom dancer. And one of the things that I always feel, and I brag to my male friends and colleagues, I hit the lottery when I met her because she loved to do technical and mechanical stuff. I always said if she had her life to live over, instead of getting an accounting and finance degree, she could have gone to MIT and become some kind of a mechanical engineer. She just loved to tinker with stuff.
mm,
And she married someone who is just a mechanical illiterate. So I was more than grateful to not only allow her to do those things but not complain that I was not involved at all. I mean, I would, if there was a heavy box or something that needed to be screwed in or hammered, I could certainly do that. I would use my size to manage that. But and she was never happier than she was when she was doing something mechanical. I always love to tell this story, Laura. Pardon me. One summer we had a very severe windstorm, and on our back deck we had a patio table and chairs set up with an umbrella, and the wind lifted the umbrella up off of its moorings, off the table, and catapulted it into the backyard, where it rolled around and bounced into the garage, bounced against the side of our garage and the fence. And at the end of the windstorm, we had an umbrella that had two broken spines, the things that help you open and keep the umbrella open. And so I was all set to go to Home Depot and just get a replacement. And she said, no, let me do that. So she took the entire weekend with this thing in our garage, where she took pieces of metal and metal coat hangers. And on a Sunday afternoon, we had this reclaimed patio table umbrella that she fixed and breathed life back into. And that was her. That was her. She did that. She loved to do that. We had a general contractor. My wife was Chinese born, and we met when she was here in America, of course. But through her connections in the local Chinese community connection, we found a wonderful guy who was a terrific handyman. I mean, he did everything, from house construction or reconstruction to remodeling, to mechanical stuff. I mean, so for almost 20 years, we used this gentleman. Spoke very little English, but he and my wife communicated in Mandarin. And when he would come on site for a project, she would be his what I call his second chair.
Oh.
She would, yeah, and he loved that. So she would be his assistant, and not only just handing him a tool, but actually being involved in the project itself. In fact, I remember one summer we had all the windows in our house replaced, and the fellow who used to accompany this guy, Jimmy was his name, who used to accompany Jimmy, couldn't make it. So he brought along his wife and recruited AiBai to help put in over 20 windows in our house during the weekend. And so it was that team. And of course, I cooked. I did what I knew I could do well. I wouldn't ever venture. So they had this wonderful relationship. They would talk on the phone at night about what, God knows what. I'm assuming it was about projects, tools and stuff. And a lovely, a very touching time during the last few days of AiBai's life when she was in hospice here at home. He stopped by. We let him know that AiBai was close to the end, and so he stopped by after probably a very long 12, 14-hour day, still dressed in his dirty clothes, construction clothes, and he was not I don't think a very sentimental, romantic guy. So he stopped, but he did stop at the local supermarket or CVS and picked up a bouquet of flowers that he brought for her. And if I can get through this without crying, Laura, I will. But he sat at the bed. And she was at that point wasn't communicating. Again, she was probably a day and a half, 2 days away from the end of her life. And he sat there holding her hand for about 10 or 15 minutes, speaking in Mandarin to her. And I like to think that he was telling her about his day and the projects he was working on, and putting siding on a house, or repairing a roof or what have you. And he was talking about drill bits and that was the language that they had. That was their language. That was their love language, if you will. And I was more than happy to accommodate this man into my life and into her life. So that was AiBai, and she loved. We had a lot in common. We both loved classical music. We both loved to cook. On holiday dinners, we would put together what we called Chinglish menus. She would do some things. She would steam a fish, or make a fried rice, and I'd make a lasagna, or something more traditional or American, and that was our holiday feast. We're half Chinese and half updated American. That's what I call my cuisine. So yeah, there was just so much that I loved about her, and I miss her. I miss her terribly, and still 6 months after she passed away, I'm, sadly, not sadly, but I guess expectedly, I am kind of rudderless a little bit, not trying to figure out what I need, where I need to go moving forward.
Paul, pardon me. Paul, you both complimented each other so beautifully. And I love the fact that you let her be who she was and she let you be who you are. And the fact that she did what she did for a living and she was very interested in these very technical things. But I love the fact, and I don't know if we talked about this when we first talked. I didn't know that she was a ballroom dancer because I've been ballroom dancing since 2011. And
Really?
I used to be competitive,
My
and
goodness. Oh, wow. She would have loved you.
yeah. Oh my gosh, I didn't realize that, but it's interesting that there's a lot of people who are in the ballroom community who have more of these kind of technical, I'll call left brain kind of
Yeah.
jobs, and then their outlet is ballroom, and there is certainly there's a technical nature to ballroom, but I didn't know that about her. How
Yeah, well,
lovely.
this is something she started, was introduced to it. I mean, in China, it's huge, and
Yes.
I guess most of the Asian countries, Japan as well.
Uh-huh.
And so she came over here sort of with that pedigree, if you will. I I was I was taught by my father. My father was this wonderful dancer. In fact, the lovely story about mom and dad was they both were they met during World War II. He was in the Air Force stationed over in Great Britain. She's from Scotland. And all the GIs would gather wherever they were stationed. They would gather on a Saturday or a Friday night at these halls within whatever town was local. And they would pile in and, dance, these big dances. And that's where he met my mom. And my mom was also a dancer. Funny though, and he brought her over to the States and they raised a family and 3 boys. And when we would go to a wedding, the women would want to dance with dad and the men would want to dance with mom. And so they would have these interchanging partners throughout the entire wedding ceremony and end up dancing probably 1 or 2 dances on their, with each other. But yeah, that's something that she was really good. I was a fan of the Latin dances, the tango and the merengue and things like that. You
Uh-huh.
could shake your hips to. And so, yeah, we would dance. There weren't too many places nowadays where you can do ballroom dancing. For a while, actually, there was a club in Boston that did have its dancing was all Latin, and so we would go there and yeah, it's great fun. She was just terrific. And I would, and again, I'm almost much like my parents, although I was never asked to dance by women. Oftentimes some men, when I would be taking a breather, they'd come up and ask AiBai to dance. And of course, I loved watching her. She was absolutely wonderful. So yeah, we did. Yeah, we complimented one another, gave each other enough space. My thing was opera, and she loved the music but didn't enjoy it as much as I did. And I was a regular listener, and we had opera playing in their home all the time. Not all the time, but frequently. And so she loved the music, but I did take her to an opera, which was a very schizophrenic experience. And you can imagine, here's this woman who speaks Mandarin as a native tongue. And we went to see Madame Butterfly, and Madame Butterfly is being performed in Italian. And on the top of the stage, you have the English subtitles crawling over. And so she didn't know where to focus, to listen, to watch, so she said, "No, you do that. I'll listen to it if you want, but I'm not going to go to another opera," which is fine. It was great because, as I said, that was my thing. And through the entirety of our marriage, because I've been listening to opera for a little over 40 years now, and one of my passions was the Saturday afternoon broadcast from the Metropolitan Opera in New York, which they did live. They performed live, and they broadcast it throughout. This is, of course, pre-internet, way back when during on various radio stations. They had a network of stations that picked up the broadcast worldwide. So no matter where you were, if you had a radio station that was part of their syndicate, you could listen to the opera. So it's what I did. Of course, then fast forward, you could listen to it online, which is what I did the last few years of our life. But for, as I said, the entirety of our marriage, every Saturday, I combined my two passions of cooking and opera. Of course, opera the season is late November through April, which of course, as we all know, is the comfort food season. So that's when we make soups and stews and casseroles. So on that Saturday for 3 or 4 hours, I would be in the kitchen. AiBai called it my golden time. I would be in the kitchen cooking. I would make a soup and a casserole for the week ahead, and then I would also make get Saturday night dinner ready, and while listening to the opera. And it was just absolutely lovely. And she would join me at the end of at like 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon when the broadcast was finished, and we'd have a glass of wine, and then make dinner, finish making dinner together. So yeah, it was. I love to romanticize things. I'm a romantic at heart, so these even during the time that I did them, that I looked at it through a romantic lens, and it was kind of like a Saturday afternoon date, if you will, for us.
Well, Paul, I think maybe, and I know that you've got some projects rolling currently. I think you might have a book in the future as well.
Well, I'm hoping so. One of the projects, based on my experience with opera and our connection as a couple to it, or lack thereof, what I'm proposing to do, and I've already begun, and I will be doing it for the balance of this year, and it's a way to process. I call it processing my grief. As we all know, grief is a funny animal. There's no playbook for it or time frame. So it's a way of me helping to process my own grief, staying in love with my wife, staying close to that love, close to my love for opera, as well as continuing to amplify the caregiver voice. So what I'm proposing, I've researched, and 8 opera companies in the U.S. are going to be performing Madame Butterfly in 2026.
Which is why I wore my butterfly necklace today.
Oh, thank you so much. Duly noted.
Thank you. I'll tell you a quick story about my butterfly, because it also ties back to ballroom. When my grandmother passed away in 2016, she was 96 and a half. We give her the half because at 96, if you made the half, I mean, you have to account for the half. Paul,
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
So my dear friend Kim Joyner, he and I were amateur ballroom partners for a while, and he gave me this necklace when my grandma passed away.
Oh,
and then when
beautiful.
my dad passed away 3 years ago, he gave my mom a butterfly as well. And so I felt very drawn to wearing my butterfly necklace today, and your love for Madame Butterfly. And I want to hear all about your project, because you've started your tour, as
I
I'll
have, yeah.
refer to it. Yeah.
Sort of backtrack a little bit. Butterfly was my first opera. When I was a graduate student at BU, my professor, I was his teaching assistant. If you were fortunate or not so fortunate, depending on your perspective around opera, which I had none at that time, but if you were his teaching assistant, which I was in the fall semester, he would drag you to an opera because that coincided with the Boston Opera Company's season, much like many opera companies in the U.S. They do their performances in the fall. And so I went, not knowing anything about opera, having any kind of footing in that art form. I went. He made me buy a suit because it was back then it was a formal affair. In fact, he and his cousin Ed, who accompanied him, they dressed in black tie, and they were not alone. Many of the men dressed in tuxedos, and the women in sort of gownish get-ups. And so anyhow, I went, and not knowing what to expect, and waiting for this thing to get over without too much pain. And then and I always tell the story, and I always get emotional because it was so emotional at the time for me. The curtain rises, the orchestra starts to play, the chorus comes out on stage, and they're singing. And about 5 minutes into Act One, Madame Butterflies appears from backstage, but you hear her voice before she makes the appearance. And Laura, I'm getting chills now because I heard this voice unlike anything I've ever heard in my entire life. And I literally looked to the ceiling in the opera house because I thought it was something divine or heaven sent, much like I do now. And so from that day, or from that evening rather, I was hooked. Don't know why, still can't explain why. I was not a poster child for someone coming into opera, but I loved it, and I started listening. And back then, this was pre-CDs, even pre-cassettes. So I went to the Boston Public Library and checked out LPs of La Traviata and La Boheme, and of course Madame Butterfly, and all the ones that they had in their catalog, and started listening to it, and would talk to my professor about it because he was a real student of opera. And it continued with me throughout my life. And I've had different times in my life where Madame Butterfly was a backdrop. At one time, my father had passed away, and I had cared for him the last year of his life, and was walking kind of aimlessly through the Boston Public Gardens and ran into a friend of mine who was the marketing director for the Boston Lyric Opera. And she explained that they were doing Madame Butterfly, and then they needed what she called supernumeraries. And and asked me if I wanted to be one. And I said, sure. What does that mean? What do I have to do? Well, basically they're the non-singing roles if you've ever been to an opera. And so I went there. And Madame Butterfly, if you know the story, it's set in 1905 Nagasaki, Japan. And I'm 6'5", 200 some odd pounds, blondish, more blonde back then, and blue eyes. And so I went there to the first rehearsal, and the director looks at me up and down, and she says, "We're going to have a hell of a time making you look Japanese." She says, how low can you crouch?" So that was my experience of Madame Butterfly as sort of a healing element in my life. And then before that, actually, when I lived in New York, after I graduated from BU, I lived in a building where a woman who's a retired college professor, who was a great opera lover, and she and I met. She lived in my building, and we ran into one another in the lobby one day, or in the mailbox, I think, and started chatting and got to know one another. And her husband, who had passed away, bequeathed her season tickets to the Metropolitan Opera. So she didn't always have people to accompany her, and asked if I wanted to go with her from time to time on occasion. And I said, of course. I mean, why wouldn't I? Metropolitan Opera. And so for 3 years, I became her semi regular partner going to the opera. I moved away. I moved back to Boston, and then and this is really a touching story. She passed away, and a friend of mine, a friend of hers rather, in our building, called me up and let me know that Margaret had died. And so I went down for the funeral and was invited to go to her daughter's home after the service for the reception. And I introduced myself, and they had no idea who I was. They got, who's the stranger? I'm sure they probably knew who everybody else was. And so I introduced myself, told them my connection to her mother, and she says, "Oh my God, we always wondered who you were. Because apparently Mom had told the kids about this strange relationship we had with this young man. Um, and so I didn't realize that. And she said, but you have, and I'll never forget her words. She said, you must know how much you meant to Mom.
Mm.
And her those times when she didn't have somebody in her life, and because opera was somebody she always connected back to her marriage. So yeah, butterfly has always been a part of my life. It seems like it keeps cropping up. So what I'm doing this next year, Laura, is I'm going on the road. I'm going to 8 different sites, all of whom are performing butterfly, and I will be not writing about Madame Butterfly 8 times. Don't worry. I will be attending the performance, speaking to members of the hopefully members of the cast and some of the people who are in the company itself. The people who run the administrative side of things. Pardon me. And then also at each stop, I'm going to be engaging with local caregivers who live in these cities, and having them share their stories. So I will be chronicling all of this in various forms on social media. I'm opening up. I really feel brave. I'm opening up an Instagram account now, and I will be putting content on there. But yes, I do hope to write a book about it. I'm calling it Butterfly Season, and it will sort of be this amalgamation of mixed narratives and a little bit of history about the opera, and of course the caregiving story. There's a couple of things. I've already been to North Carolina. I'm coming up to New York City. In fact, later today, I'm so excited, I will actually be speaking to the gentleman who is in charge of the archives at the Metropolitan Opera. So he's going to give me a little bit of a history lesson on Butterfly at the Met, what it means to him. So that's going to be part of the narrative, and I'm waiting to hear back. I think I'm very close to. I will be engaging with local caregivers in New York through some of my communications connections, with assembling caregivers who are employees of a couple of PR firms. And I'll be speaking with them, and. So, yeah, I'm delighted at these opportunities. Also, I just was speaking to people. One of my stops will be in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and they actually are putting together an opera. As I said, Butterfly is set in Japan, so all the Asian characters of the cast will be, in fact, performed by Asian or Asian American singers for the Grand Rapids production, and the director, I'm told, is also of Asian descent. So to me, that's going to be an incredible performance and also opportunity to see something like that. So, I hope to have these kinds of local stories in each of my stops. But yeah, in fact, I will be coming to Chicago at the end of March, early April. Still haven't figured out the timing around that. Of course, the Lyric Opera is a very, very famous opera house, opera company, with international acclaim.
You'll have to let me know, Paul, when you come in, and hopefully we can grab a lunch or a coffee or something like that.
Of course. Yes, absolutely.
I'd love to see you.
Absolutely. So that's, as I said, that's part. I think the strongest element of this is really giving me something that's going to keep me close to AiBai. And I don't know, grief is such a funny animal. I think most of us have experienced it at some time in our lives, and it means and impacts everybody differently. How you process that is such a personal choice and decision. And so this is going to be, at least so far, it's going to be my way of trying to do some of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and are the caregivers that you're talking with, Paul, are they caregivers specifically to loved ones who have or have had Parkinson's?
No, not necessarily. It is really going to be a blend. I have no say in who. I'm going to allow the local resources to help curate these speakers, if you will, or these caregivers, I should say. Yeah, I think there are such universal experiences throughout all caregivers, whether you're someone with Parkinson's or you're a sandwich caregiver, or you are caring for a loved one or a child or someone with cancer or what have you. So I think so much of what we do is universal in that caregiving language. I think to hear these stories, I don't necessarily have to make it part of my own story of caring for AiBai with her Parkinson's.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah,
think that's even going to be better because it's going to be such a unique blend and sort of a patchwork of stories.
Yeah, I love that you're tying all of that together, and, I was just recalling another guest that I had on my show, a few years ago. Her name is Suzanne Marriott, and she wrote a book called Watching for Dragonflies, and it was a book about her journey being a caregiver to her husband who had MS, and that was one of his favorite things to do, was to watch for dragonflies where they lived in an area where they live. So, um, so it's so much of what is produced out there in the way of books or movies or just content that's out there is so much of the healing process for so many purposes. And you hear the term make your mess your message, or whatever, however you want to term that, that our situations or our trials and tribulations are channeled through in very productive ways in hopes that it not only heals us, but it helps heal other people. And I think with caregiving, kind of an example, I recently facilitated a caregiver advisory board with caregivers to loved ones who have severe COPD. And so many of them had said, well, we're as caregivers, we don't feel we always have the resources, or we don't know that somebody else feels the same frustration that I do. One woman had said, and when I had asked the group, how do you cope with the feelings behind being a caregiver, the frustration, the sadness, the anger, whatever it might be. And one woman just very frankly said, I cry in the shower. And it just made me realize that there's this, um, I don't know, kind of this unheard voice. And a lot of what I do is about hearing unheard voices, especially in healthcare. The unheard voices from a caregiver standpoint, where so many of them felt that they were alone. And so I love the fact that you are going through this tour, this butterfly tour, and really bringing caregivers together. And I'm sure you'll be facilitating some conversation around everyone's experiences, and hopefully it does bring some peace in a way that caregivers are not alone when it comes to their labor of love, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, caregiving is often done in silence, as you had indicated, Laura. I mean, that's one of the things I think we as caregivers will all agree upon. We're too busy caring to tell our stories, especially men. But it's something that you do because you have to do it. You don't expect any reward for it. It'd be nice if there were some compensation, but there's not, largely. But it's done in isolation, and that's because you are so involved. And this is, I always say that, much like grief begins at time of diagnosis, when you receive the diagnosis, immediately you jump into caregiving shoes, and that becomes your identity. And no matter what the illness or the scope of that disease trajectory, how long it will be, you become a caregiver first and foremost. Everything else spills into second place and beyond. Um, you're a husband or a wife or a spouse or a partner in the second chair.
Mhm.
You're a communications professional, or you're a writer, or you're a doctor, or you're a lawyer in a second chair, because first you are a caregiver, and that's the most important thing, because it has to be. And it's not a part-time, it's a full-time. Obviously, I had the benefit, we had both, AiBai and we had the benefit of her illness not really controlling her life the way it eventually did during those first 8 or 9 years. We were able to live a, pardon me, a somewhat normalized life, home, careers, travel, social life. But then as things progress and the condition worsens, in a case like Parkinson's, and in the case of my wife, who was very private, she didn't want people to know of her illness. She was kind of forced into an early retirement because of that, because the illness became so much more pronounced and visible that her being in an office as a assistant controller made no sense. It just wouldn't happen. She wouldn't allow it. She wouldn't want it. Nor would I expect her to. Nor would I, kind of force the matter. So you become not only isolated, but all the ramifications beyond that. One pay, you go from 2 paycheck to 1 paycheck, and all those kinds of, the financial pressures start. So it becomes this snowball effect. But the isolation, I think, is maybe the worst, because it's a very solitary existence. And despite friends and family who are all well-intended, I don't ever doubt the intentions of the people who say, let me know if there's anything I can do. I know they mean it, but what they don't understand is I don't have time to assign you a task, especially for someone who is in my situation, dealing with a advancing Parkinson's physical disease, along with the dementia and the cognitive element of that dementia. And
Yeah.
it became all encompassing. I don't have the time. I'm so busy. Even the idea of meeting me for a coffee or a drink, why would I bother? Because all the time that I'm elsewhere having that social moment with a friend, my mind is back home with my wife. So I mean, I guess some of the isolation is in fact self-imposed, but it becomes isolating, and because of that, it becomes much more difficult for you to cope with that kind of a situation.
Paul, we hear a lot about wives in particular that are caregivers. I think there's always that assumption that, let's face it, the husbands usually pass first, and it's the wife that is in that caregiver role before the husband might be. And it probably switches off because one spouse could have a surgery, and so it could be the husband taking care of the wife because she had hip surgery, and then things flip flop because maybe the husband had something going on. But from the standpoint of a condition like AiBai's that was terminal, uh, what would you say maybe is different for a husband, let's say, than maybe a wife? Have you had conversations or maybe observed differences in any ways?
Well, and I think that the differences are social, and how in the perspective of the different genders. I mean, it's true. Women are the thought of as caregivers in our society, and I would imagine in most societies. It's a female-dominated situation. Obviously, there are many, and I think there's 63 million caregivers, according to the recent AARP figures in the U.S. However, we don't sue us. 40% of those are men. So there are 20 plus million male caregivers. I think because it was always perceived as women's work, if you will, air quotes, men were reluctant to get involved. However, some situations are reversed. Sometimes it is the wife or the female, the mother, whoever gets ill first in a relationship, and so it's incumbent upon the man to take on that role. I think, the responsibilities are the same. It's just, I think how we approach them and how the rest of society perceives those, that role is unique to each gender. I think, again, we are the strong and silent type, so men don't necessarily tell their stories and share their stories and their experiences around caregiving, which is why we thought of, developing a podcast around men who are caregivers, just because I felt that there was all these stories that were not being told. And I think that we're near. I think from a perspective of just other men knowing that they had sort of fellow caregivers out there could be reassuring to them. They maybe don't feel so isolated or so alone. What we did recognize, however, was the fact that, in fact, my co-host Bob Coughlin, we always say that we stand on the shoulders of giants when it comes to caregivers. The women caregivers paved the way for us men. They showed us how it was done, how it should be done. And so even though we continued on with the on with the title, Men in the Culture of Caregiving, we realized that because of the status of women caregivers, we would be missing out on all these wonderfully rich stories if we didn't invite women to participate. So even though we have it's still a podcast that is seen through our male lens, if you will, Bob and I. So we still see it through our perspective, but we do include these wonderfully rich and my God, compelling stories of women who, much like any caregiver, are all about sacrifice and compassion. And it starts with love. So, men, you're in love with your wives, you're in love with your girlfriends or partners. So you should be a caregiver as well. That's where it starts, and that you're already halfway there if you have that.
Paul, for husbands who are faced with having to take on the role of being a caregiver to a wife or a partner, what do you think you would advise I guess I hate to say a newly minted caregiver, but for someone who finds themselves in that role? Because if you're in a relationship, my assumption, because I've never been married, but my assumption, or even if it's to a parent, let's say, my assumption is that that certainly isn't a role that you maybe asked for, but certainly in a relationship, that's something that I'm assuming people are signed up for, if you will. But it's nothing that, we might know, okay, one day this might come along. And then when it does, what would you advise someone who has just gotten into this caregiver role? And I'm sure it has changed, and I'd love to get your perspective too in terms of how you saw your role as a caregiver changing. But if you think about it in phases, what would you recommend, or how would you advise someone to think about their role as a caregiver?
Yeah. Well, I think, right away, as I said before, you are going to be a caregiver first. And so understand that is your primary role in life, not just at home, but just in your life in general, and how that's going to ripple into the other areas. That's going to impact what you do for work in your career. It's going to reverberate with you in the relationship you may have with your children or your families or your friends. This is, and again, it can change. And in my case, it did change. You become more involved as a disease progresses. And if you're unfortunate enough to have a situation where you're supporting someone with that kind of progressive disease for which there's no cure and ultimately will shorten their life, then you need to at least mentally sign up for the fact that your life is going to change. And and so you're going to need to accommodate some things in your life that you may not otherwise have perceived initially. Work is going to, you have to figure out something around your career. And I know a lot of times companies don't necessarily support employees who may be caregivers as well, but I think it's something that they need to consider because more and more of us are becoming caregivers, and I think it would be a pity if you and I know this probably has happened to people who have to arrive late or leave early from their job because of some emergency. I had the good fortune of being able to work. I've worked from home for the past 30 years, so I was able to accommodate any and all of these things. However, these emergencies do come up where you have to respond to them because, as I said, you're a caregiver first. And you can't just say, well, honey, I can't do that now. I'm walking into a meeting. Unfortunately, you're not going to walk into that meeting. And I know that can impact your career. So you have to at least start making mental preparations for those things. Maybe it's a change in career. Maybe it is I don't know. Again, if if you can have frank discussions with your supervisors or your bosses or people who own the companies that you're working for, I don't know what those conversations might look like or what
Yeah.
they may result in. You know, also you have to start looking at other resources. Who and what are those resources that can in fact help you?
Paul, didn't you say you were doing some work or maybe had moderated a conversation with a company with regard to caregiving and how it's being handled in the workplace? Did I recall that correctly?
Yes. Yeah, in fact, right before AiBai passed away, I was asked to present my story to a local biotech company here in the Boston area. And as I always do when I come in to speak, whether it's my podcast or on my own, I always ask for a show of hands and of employees who are comfortable enough letting the rest of their coworkers know that they're caregivers, if they don't already know. But usually it's about 20 to 25% of the workforce will be have some semblance of a caregiver role. So I did. I shared my story. In fact, it was nice because I shared it with two people, the CEO of the company, which to me was very telling. The fact that, okay, if I'm talking to the CEO, I have an inkling as to this company embracing the role of the caregiver as it may influence their employees, and the head of one of the heads of the R&D research and development area. So we had the medical and science perspective as well as the company perspective and my perspective personal. And one of the questions that I was asked by one of the people in attendance was, how can we as a company support you? And getting back to the isolation, my sort of tried and true answer to that is, don't ask, just do. We all have, we're all bright people. Laura, I know if you were in a similar role, what your needs might be. I can send you over groceries. I can maybe come and clean your house or, I won't expect you to come and join me for an outside coffee or drink or a meal. But, there are certain things so I always say, just do it. Don't ask if I need something. I need a lot. So, and those are the resources that I was speaking to. I think as a caregiver, one of the things you need to do, arm yourself with resources, and they might be resources that you get as part of the hospital experience or the medical experience. All hospitals have social work departments, and they're wonderful resources for you as a budding caregiver to identify, what are some of those programs that may be available to me. Most of the caregiving support, the home health aid support, when you might need it, unfortunately, is out of pocket unless you, of course, you qualify if you're a lower income. In our case, we didn't. We had home health aides coming in for almost 3 years, and it was an out-of-pocket expense that I had to incur. But there are other sources that are available, and even if they are, something that you have to pay for, I think they're worth considering. There are support groups for caregivers. Many of them are now, in fact, I think they all make available a Zoom or an online or a remote option. You don't necessarily have to go to a particular site to meet with groups. Those kinds of resources, Medicine is another area that's an expense that we have to, at the end of AiBai's life, she was taking upwards of 20 pills a day. Yeah, and some of them are not cheap. One was $400 a month. There are some programs, and again, this is something I found out through the social work and through the nursing assistants, or physician assistant, I should say. A lot of drug manufacturers have programs that caregivers and families can take advantage of that provide reduced costs for medicines. I think, arm yourself with that kind of knowledge. Stay in touch with the healthcare team about the illness itself. How it progresses and what you should expect as it progresses. I think those are the things that I would tell any caregiver. Your life is going to change dramatically depending on how long you have to, act in that role, and also whenever possible, identify and arm yourself with a resource that can help your life.
Mm-hmm. It seems, Paul, that not only does a caregiver have to advocate for their loved one, but they're also advocating for yourself as the caregiver. And so where do you think there's the gap or unmet need, as we like to talk about in healthcare and pharma, from the standpoint of where the healthcare system is maybe failing caregivers? What could the healthcare system do better as far as the caregiver role goes?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lauren, and it is a huge need. Caregivers historically have always been the wallflower. I would go to my wife's appointments, and as much as I was a large physical presence, I was rarely included in the conversations. Because of my field in which I worked, I had a little bit more intelligence than most, so I was able to, insert myself into these conversations a little bit more readily than others. And I've talked to men who are and also women who are caring for their husbands or male partners. And they say the same thing. We are treated like a fifth wheel. We're not involved in the conversation. So I say, insert yourself as much as possible. I think it's incumbent upon the industry and the medical and the healthcare community to recognize the fact that if you are interested in benefiting a patient, well, there's nobody more closer to the patient than the person who is caring for them at home. So it's really important that you identify and recognize that voice and start to get information, be it anecdotal or most of the stuff that I communicate to my wife's healthcare team over the years was in fact anecdotal. It was a response to a new medicine or a behavior change or something like that. But it's important for them to understand the impact that their medicines are having. And also, if you're a drug manufacturer, if you're in a clinical trial, the caregiver sees once the patient comes home from the clinic, they see the reaction and any kind of side effects. So that is information that is very critical to their drug development program to understand. So I think if you can't insert yourself into these situations, I think drug manufacturers and healthcare teams have to recognize that you need to be invited.
Mm-hmm. And so from a caregiver perspective, why do you think caregivers aren't, I guess, spoken to or part of the conversation?
Yeah, I just think it's part of the history where we were, the focus was on the patient. So that was where the conversations were directed. How do you feel? How's the medicine? Or, whatever the questions were largely directed at the patient. And we were, in fact, I've been in a situation where I've seen couples arrive for a medical appointment and the patient will go in and meet with a doctor, and the spouse or the partner will remain out in the waiting room, going through magazines. So, I think it's sort of a mindset. I see it changing. I obviously have been a more vocal caregiver in the past 2 to 3 years with my podcast and my writing and the things that I'm doing and speaking and all. So I'm sensing a change because we are becoming a louder voice. I mean, this past spring, I had the privilege of interviewing the producer and director for our podcast of the Bradley Cooper documentary called Caregiving, aptly named. That was a PBS film, and it's on their website for anybody who wants to go on pbs.org and type in caregiving. And it's a wonderful 2-hour documentary on the challenges around caregiving, from the emotional challenges that we face as caregivers to some of the, you talked about where the gaps. They identify a lot of the gaps around compensation and support systems and resources. There's these wonderful and rich and very tragic stories from the caregivers who unfortunately are in situations which are very, very challenging and difficult because they have to take care of their kids or their wife or both. There's one gentleman who's featured. He was a young man, probably in his early 30s, and his wife came down with this horrific neurological disease. But now, and at the same time, they have a young son who's probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years old. And it was his sole responsibility to take care of the both of them. So I see that the caregiving voice through these kinds of situations. I'm seeing a lot more programs out there that are in support of caregivers that are coming to the fore. So I see a lot of this changing. We're not there yet. We're certainly not there yet. I think one of the big challenges we have as a culture is supporting the caregivers on the job. I think because if your job goes away, everything else changes. I mean, I know in my own situation, and I could do this, and I did, but about 2 years ago, I walked away I stepped away in large part from my career because of the demands that I had here at home. I just I could no longer commit to these even though I was a contract employee or consultant, if you will. I still had somebody who was depending upon me, and I could not let that person down. And I knew full well that as AiBai's disease continued to progress and continued to worsen, that I would, in fact, disappoint somebody by not meeting a deadline, having to respond to emergency. I mean, in my 18 years, I mean, not so much in the early part, but in the latter years, I had to call 911 4 or 5 times and have her rushed to the hospital for various reasons.
Sure.
So imagine if you're, again, stepping into a Zoom, where's your decision? There's no choice. You have to respond to the family issue,
Right.
which leaves somebody else wanting. And so I didn't want to kind of sully my reputation by having to do that and disappoint people and not be able to commit to deadlines and so on. So it was easier to just step away until the end.
Yeah, understood. Paul, with everything that you're doing with your butterfly project and your podcast, if AiBai could see what you're doing now with all that you're working on and working through and the way you're honoring her, what do you think she would say to you?
Oh, I think she'd understand why I'm doing it because I was never shy about showing my love for her. I always used to say that we were one of the things that I introduced to her was my love for romantic comedies. I know, go figure, right? It's a guy thing. And one of our favorite movies was, given her Chinese descent, was Crazy Rich Asians. And one of my favorite.
Was it really considered a rom-com?
Gosh, yeah.
Oh, really?
I would.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. As a card carrying as a card carrying crying guy, Laura, I would definitely put it in that category.
Well, I won't let you lose your man card or anything
No,
over
no,
that, Paul.
I'm very comfortable in the skin of a romantic comedy
Aw,
viewer. But
I love
anyhow,
it.
one of the great lines at the end where the man comes to his senses and tries to make things better and proposes to this girlfriend that he unfortunately has been ostracized by his family. He says, "Wherever you belong, or wherever you are in the world, that's where I belong." And that's I used to say that to her every night before we go to bed. But if she were to see me, I think she'd know that I was why I was doing this. I know she would appreciate it, because I've never not supported her in our marriage. But also, I think she would have a message for the healthcare system and the drug developing industry, and she would say, "Listen to him. He's a smart guy, and he's got a lot of great experience and knowledge, and this is important for so many people, so many millions of people." I mean, those 63 million caregivers that I mentioned, there's at least 63 million, if not more, people to whom they are offering support. So this is a large percentage of the population. So what I say, what others in my position are saying, are they're important and they're impactful things, and they make sense. And you need to listen to us. And I know she would agree.
And there's caregiving at varying levels, as you know,
Sure,
in terms of
absolutely.
where it starts and where it ends, unfortunately. But Paul, anything else that you would like to make sure that our listeners learn from you or learn about your projects? We'll certainly put the links in the show notes
Yeah.
to your podcast, to the PBS special that you referenced, and anything else that we talked about here. But anything you'd like to wrap up with?
Sure. I mean, I can't remember the exact words, but there's this very famous Rosalind Carter quote. Rosalind Carter, obviously the former First Lady of the U.S., Jimmy Carter's wife, and a lifelong caregiver and an advocate for caregivers. And she would always talk about the 4 different kinds of people in the world. Those who are caregivers, those who will be caregivers, those who will need caregivers. And there's another one that I I can never remember, but I always said I'd like to add the 5th one: those who support caregivers. And that's you and that's me. And I think those are the people we need to reckon that and reconcile that in our lives. We all know caregivers. And as I said, support comes in so many different ways. Doesn't always have to be a grand gesture. Doesn't have to be paying my utility bill. It can be something simple, but something that is so valuable and so needed. So I would say let's add that 5th element to Rosalind Carter's quote, and we as a society let's start understanding how we can support caregivers, because it's support that we eventually will covet ourselves at some point in our life.
Absolutely. Paul, thank you so much for being with me today and your courage for bringing so much of this to other caregivers as you are going through your own grief and healing journey. I know that our conversation will be just such an immense help to someone in a similar situation. And thank you for all your work and your advocacy. And I so appreciate you sharing with me today.
Well, thank you, Laura. This has been a wonderful opportunity. I want to thank you for having this kind of a vehicle where these kinds of messages and conversations can be held. And I think that, again, they're terribly important. What I know about podcasts is that people are listening. So I'm depending upon your listeners to hear what we are talking about today and acting upon that, hopefully in their own lives.
Yes. Well, Paul, thank you again. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Stay well and keep pushing for answers. Oh my goodness, that's a wrap on another compelling story. Thanks for listening to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. If you would like more information about today's guests or to find out more about Laura, go to DesperateForADiagnosis.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow show updates and healthcare news on the podcast's Facebook page. If you would like to be a guest on the show, or if you have any questions, advice, or suggestions for our guests, please email me at lauramarie@desperateforadiagnosis.com. Please note, I am not a medical professional, nor am I affiliated with any healthcare, pharmaceutical, or device company. I am an entrepreneur and an independent market researcher focused on helping healthcare organizations better understand the patient perspective. The podcast is not meant to offer medical advice, but to merely share the stories and perspectives of podcast guests.